Hey everyone, welcome to a new video on this channel. This time we're going to have a talk about the application gateway, which is basically a layer 7 load balancer or reverse proxy that you can deploy in Azure to publish applications securely. And we're going to deploy that together with the application gateway Ingress controller on Kubernetes, which basically configures the application gateway for us. Now, what's the scenario here? Well, typically, of course, you have applications running in your Kubernetes cluster. They need to be exposed either internally on your internal network or externally on the internet. In this case, we're going to publish an application externally on the internet, and we'll also use Cloudflare for this to mix it up a bit and to see how you actually can do that. So what we want is that we have connectivity coming in to, in this case, a URL rt.bake, that's how you pronounce it, .info. So users connect to Cloudflare. Cloudflare then knows that it has to forward this traffic to the public IP of the application gateway. And by use of the application gateway Ingress controller, it has automatically configured application gateway to route these requests to the correct backend pods running in the Kubernetes cluster. I already deployed the Kubernetes cluster, so we're not going to wait for that or do that. It's deployed standard cluster using advanced networking or the Azure CNI plugin. So it's in its own VNet, right? So what we have to do is we have to deploy first the application gateway together with a public IP, and then we'll install or configure the application gateway Ingress controller, and we'll see how that all works. So let's do the application gateway first, and let's clear this out. The first thing we have to do is we have to create, let's clear this again, yes, we have to create our public IP address. So let's just copy this here, yeah, and here you see the as network public IP create command. We create a public IP called pip AGIC in our resource group AGIC, and for the application gateway v2 SKU, so we're using the v2. The allocation method has to be static, so static IP, and has to be the standard SKU. And this is all related to the type of IP address that you get. So we give it some time to create this public IP, and then we're done with this part, basically. If we look in our resource group and we refresh or we look at the group, we'll see indeed that this public IP has been created. If I click on the public IP, you will see that it has this IP address. It's important that I configure this already at the Cloudflare level, right? So I'm having here my RT record. I'm going to paste this in and save it. And important as well that this is a proxied record, right? So I'm going to save this, because later on, of course, we want to connect to our application using this rt.bake.info. So that's already been done. We have created our public IP. Next, we have to create our application gateway. So we have to create this component here. Now, for those who already have worked with this, there's a way, of course, to let the Kubernetes deployment create the application gateway. So in one command to deploy a Kubernetes cluster, and then with a couple of parameters also specify you want to have the application gateway Ingress controller and an application gateway deployed. We don't do that here. So we create our own application gateway, and we specify that it has to use the public IP that we just created. Great. How are we going to do that? Well, we could do this from the portal, but the portal is actually asking us to do all kinds of configuration we don't need. So I recommend that you do the actual deployment using the Azure CLI. So here you see the command there. So as network application gateway, we're going to create one with the name of AGIC in East US region in a resource group. And I'm seeing there that there's a small typo. So we're going to go here, and indeed there needs to be a space between the location of East US and then the group called AGIC. So that's quite important that we have that. So yeah, we're going to use the standard V2 version of application gateway. We are going to configure, and that's maybe important to note, we are going to configure the application gateway ingress controller using an AKS add-on. And the add-on only supports application gateway V2. Now in general, I recommend that you use application gateway V2 and not the older version. But it's important that you know that that is required when you install the application gateway ingress controller. We'll do that later with the Azure CLI, right? So let's go back to our command and let's just run this and see what this gives. So also look at indeed the fact that we are using this pip AGIC public IP that we just created. And oh yeah, actually I forgot something, and that's really good that I forgot this, because there's a problem. You need to actually deploy this this application gateway. It needs its own subnet somewhere. It needs to be integrated into a VNet. I did not create the subnet here called AG. So this thing should fail in a moment since the subnet is not there, right? That's okay. So let's clear this out, and it's good. I'm leaving this in. We're first going to create the subnet. The subnet can of course be created anywhere. I'm just going to reuse the VNet that is used by my Kubernetes cluster, and I'm going to create a separate subnet in there. So I'm just clicking plus subnet here. I'm calling it AG. I'm giving it a IP of 10.241. I'm going to give it 1. Well, I could actually do 0.0/24. It's way too big, basically a 24, but that's okay. You can look in the docs. What you normally require for the application gateway. You need to be able to support, of course, the number of instances you're going to deploy or you're going to roll out for application gateway. It can scale out to multiple instances to handle the load, and of course you need IP addresses to be able to then deploy those instances. In my case, what I'm going to do here, this 24 is too big, but it's okay. I don't need anything else, so I'm going to click OK here. And normally, of course, I would recommend that you create this using the Azure CLI. So we have our application gateway subnet. Then we can go back to our command and deploy this AGIC again, right? Here you see the reference to the subnet. Normally that should work now. So let's give it a go. And hopefully it can now create the application gateway properly. So we give it some time, and then we'll be back. All right, the creation of the application gateway is finished, and now we can proceed by creating or installing the application gateway ingress controller. Let's look how that works. And the first thing that you should do is getting the ID of the application gateway of the application gateway. We can do that by looking in the portal or by just running this command over here, which would give me the ID of the application gateway. And now we can install the application gateway ingress controller. Now, to do so, I'm going to use the following command, but this command indeed requires the ID of the application gateway, because the ingress controller needs to know what application gateway to configure when you create ingresses in Kubernetes. So note a few things here. We are using an add-on to deploy the application gateway ingress controller. So with the enable add-ons feature, the name of the add-on is ingress-AG. app gateway. And there are several add-ons, like the add-on to do Azure Monitor and so forth. This is the Ingress Application Gateway add-on. Be aware that at the point or at the time of recording, this is still a preview feature, so it shouldn't be used in production. But I do recommend from the moment it is in production that you install the Application Gateway Ingress controller using this method. Why? Well, then it's fully supported as part of AKS. It's also automatically upgraded and so forth. If you want to do deployments today, you should actually use the Helm chart to deploy this Application Gateway Ingress controller. But of course, when you do the installation with the Helm chart, that's separate of your AKS installation, then you are required to do things like maintaining it and upgrading it and so forth. So yeah, the add-on is recommended, but today it's still in preview. So this enables the add-on, and this points as well to the application gateway that we just deployed. Let's run this command. Now it's important to see here that this command has been altered by the following extension, AKS preview. You have to look in the docs to basically configure your system to even support this preview of this application gateway ingress controller via add-on, right? You just need to find that out here. So if you Google AGIC add-on, you normally should find this tutorial over here, and there you'll see that there are all kinds of prerequisites. You have to do this feature registration, then you have to register the container service provider again, you have to add an extension to your Azure CLI and so forth. So with this article over here, you'll be able to install the application gateway ingress controller as an add-on. But I already did that, didn't want to bore you with that part of it. So we give this some time to let itself to configure itself basically, and then we come back to look at what was installed on the cluster. All right, the application gateway ingress controller was installed. This is basically the output of the entire installation. Now let's take a look what was actually done here. So the first thing we'll do, I'll just open another window here. The first thing we'll do is we'll get our credentials to this cluster. So we use the Azure CLI for this to get these credentials. And I will override what I already had because I reuse that name here. And then I'm just going to use a tool called K9S. You can look it up, the K9S tool, and see how to install this on your system. This is basically a management tool for Kubernetes in the CLI. And I'm going to go to all namespaces. And when I go to all namespaces, I should see that there is this component here, this one, which is the Ingress Application Gateway deployment pod in kube system. It's running. Let's check the logs and to see if that thing is not complaining about something. So when we check the logs, yeah, I see there's an error there. What does the error basically say? It says that, well, I got a status code 403 while I'm doing a get on application gateway. It basically means that this component does not have access to read the application gateway state, and probably doesn't have access to modify the application gateway state. And that's important because, as I said already, this thing, the ingress controller, looks at ingresses that you create on Kubernetes. We'll see that later. And then it configures the application gateway accordingly using ARM, right? So Azure Resource Manager. So it needs access to it. Let's do that. Let's go to my resource group here, which is AGIC. When I refresh AGIC, you'll see that the application gateway is also there. In the application gateway, I have my access control settings. I'm going to add a role assignment. The role is going to be a contributor. And then if we go, this one is correct. If I'm going to look for ingress, you'll see an Ingress Application Gateway AGIC there. That's the one that I actually need, because this is a user-managed identity that is being used by this Application Gateway Ingress controller. So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to click Save. And when I then go back to my application over here and the logs, once the role has been assigned, this error should go away. So it's retrying every 10 seconds. And then it should be able to read the application gateway and also do modification at the application gateway ingress controller level. All right, I gave the system some time for these rights to go into effect. And what you'll see then in this application is that indeed you have the logs, and the logs basically state that they can read. You can see that here, they can read all the backend settings and so forth, routing rules, etc. All this kind of stuff can now be read from the application gateway ingress controller. Maybe a good tip as well is, if you're having the same problem, just go to this pod over here, use Control K to kill it, which I did now. This is basically a deployment which is behind it, so the deployment will recreate the pod for you, and then normally things should start working properly. So as you can see here, indeed he can read from the application gateway configuration. So that has been fixed. So now we should be able to deploy an application to our cluster, and that application should use the application gateway ingress controller and the application gateway to publish its information here. Now, the first thing I'm going to do, and that's important here, I want to have SSL to SSL connectivity. So I want to have secure TLS connections going into Cloudflare, and Cloudflare, because I have strict mode configured, Cloudflare should connect with SSL to my application gateway. Now, there are several ways in how to handle this, but of course for application gateway to work, it needs to have a certificate as well in place. If we're using Cloudflare, we can use origin certificates, and these are certificates provided by Cloudflare itself, which it trusts, that we can install on application gateway. And we can basically instruct our ingress to use an existing installed certificate on application gateway. And you'll see in a moment how that works. But that means that first I have to install a certificate on my application gateway. I would do that with and that's not the window I wanted. I would do that with the following command. I'm just going to exit this. I'm going to go, actually I'm going to leave this here. I'm going to go to my other window here, and let's all minimize this a bit. I'm going to clear this out. I'm in a folder that contains some YAML files, but also a PFX file. So the PFX file contains the Cloudflare origin certificate and private key, of course, and it has a password on it. So with the following command, we would install this on our system. Now I will do this, but I will basically do this on another screen, so that you don't see the password that I'm using there, right? So I'm going to use the same command, but I'm going to provide the password to the command. Now let's look at the actual application we are going to deploy. The application we're going to deploy is one I have used before in other demos. So it's an application that first of all uses Redis for some backend stuff. That's not important. That's the service for Redis. Then we have a deployment of an app called Real-Time App. That's an app I wrote myself in Go, which is providing some WebSockets connectivity to a browser, and it reflects the data sent to Redis and at the backend. Not really important what the application does. So the real-time app has a service which is basically using port 80. The pods are using port 8080, but the important thing here is our ingress. So we define an ingress like we normally define an ingress on Kubernetes, but in this case we're specifying that the ingress class we'd like to use is the Azure Application Gateway. So our Application Gateway ingress controller will then know, hey, I have to do something, I have to do some work to basically expose this application properly. Now, when I would have multiple instances of this application deployed, I would also need some cookie-based affinity to basically allow correct load balancing. And here, what you see here is that we are using a already installed certificate on the application gateway, which is called origin, right? I just saved that. That's the command that I shown you earlier. That's this command over here that you've seen me using. I'm going to go back and copy it here so you can see it. I call this certificate origin, right? So I'm referring to that certificate on the application gateway. Yeah, this I think is not necessary, but I also specified that the application gateway should connect to the pods using HTTP, not HTTPS, but that's okay. And of course, we also specify some things like, okay, this is the host name, and you need to also know, or the application gateway needs to also know, yeah, what service do I need to reach? And what the application gateway will do, it will take the endpoints of the service and it will route directly to the endpoints, so to the IPs of the pods that implement our application here, right? So that's an important one to note. So this is all that is required. This ingress definition that you see over here, if I'm marking it completely like this, that is all that is required to basically tell our application gateway ingress controller to configure the application gateway properly and create the backend, the listeners, the routing rules, and so forth. Let's submit this application and see what happens, right? So let's clear this out. Again, ls, and let's do a k apply f alias kube control, k apply -f, and then real time. Yeah, maybe I should use real time YAML, right? So we're doing that, we're applying all of this. If you go back to K9S, you'll see now that in the default namespace, he's creating the things that I just asked him to create. So that's fine. If we're going to our Ingress application gateway deployment over here, and we look at the logs, what we should see that he's doing the configuration here. For example, if I'm going to, let's take a look if it's already there. You should see that he's doing things for rt bake.info. So let's check it out. I might not be there yet. No, might not be there yet. So it will take a while. It's polling. It's looking for these resources and then basically creating these resources. So I think now he should have done that. So we have a backend address pool. We have indeed a listener configured. We have, and there you see it here. You see, in fact, that the rt.bake.info is used to set the host, etc. All this kind of stuff is now being configured on this application gateway. If you go to the application gateway, so to AGIC, that's how we called it, and then we go to our listeners, you'll see a listener here, which is using HTTPS associated to a rule, which is this rule, that connects it to a specific backend, and the backend pool is this one. This is the backend pool for our real-time app. When we look at the backend pool, what we'll see here is basically the IP address of the pod that is running the real-time app. So if I have multiple pods, for instance, when I'm doing load balancing and so forth, you will see multiple targets there. The Ingress controller is basically responsible for updating our application gateway whenever these things change, right? So if the pod dies and a new pod appears and the IP changes, then this will be modified here in the backend targets automatically. Now, this also means that everything should work properly, and maybe let's go back to our AGIC and go back to the listener one last time, and to show that the listener is using the origin certificate that we configured previously. And indeed, this one is being used, and that's of course all the result of using the annotation here on the Ingress definition to specify that we want to use the origin certificate. Of course, the real test is in, does it actually work? So if I'm going to rt.bake.info, do I get this application here? And yes, I get the application. And by the way, I'm continuously sending a message to Redis as well. It's then being picked up by the real-time app, which is then using WebSockets. This is just using WebSockets to get this real-time information from that service. So this basically worked, but of course remember we are connecting to Cloudflare here, right? So this is a Cloudflare proxy we're using. So we're connecting to Cloudflare. Cloudflare can do things like inspection and WAF and so forth, and then Cloudflare redirects this to the IP of our application gateway Ingress controller, but it's fully SSL. So SSL here, SSL there, because we use this fully supported origin cert there. Okay, great. We come to the end of this video. We've seen how to deploy the application gateway. We've seen how to deploy the application gateway Ingress controller and how to create regular ingresses in Kubernetes to basically configure the application gateway automatically. Of course, here I threw in Cloudflare in the mix. You don't actually need Cloudflare. You can just as well provide access via the public IP of the application gateway. Application gateway can also be configured to do web application firewalling. So that's not really an issue. However, we do see that with a lot of customers that I'm working with, that they're using Cloudflare for DNS and they're used to using Cloudflare to publish websites and so forth. So the combination of Cloudflare with something like application gateway, which then exposes web applications that run on Kubernetes or on virtual machines or basically on anything else, is quite a common scenario. Okay. Thanks for watching and see you some other time.